Hi everyone, it's Miss White, and I'm here to do the final Unit 3 reading from Peter Singer. It's most of, or some of, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, which, if you get a chance, I'd recommend you read the whole thing. It's quite an interesting read. But what a way to finish Unit 3 on not only a philosopher who's alive, but one who lives in Melbourne. So that's very, very exciting. So for today's reading, we're mostly focusing on obligations. You could also say that it comes a bit under being morally good and the individual and others. So nearly all of your questions for Unit 3 Area of Study 2 relate to this. So before we begin, it's probably good to give you a little bit of background about um, what was going on at the time he was writing it. And he's going to tell you that as he writes this in November 1971. So, for a bit of the history, after 1971, West Pakistani army invaded East Pakistan. There was war, there was a Bengali genocide. Then East Bengal becomes Bangladesh, and there was a death toll between 200,000 and 3 million people. So there was a lot going on. There was a lot of famine, there was a lot of death, and there was a lot of war happening, which Singer is going to talk about, and how we in the Western world should be supporting people in East Bengal. So as always, I'll talk you through my annotations. I'll read it aloud, and hopefully it is helpful for your VCE studies. So thank you, everyone. Let's get started. So we've got famine, affluence, and morality. As I write this, in November 1971, people are dying in East Bengal from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. The suffering and death toll that are occurring there are now not inevitable, not unavoidable in any fatalistic sense of the term. Constant poverty, a cyclone, and a civil war have turned at least 9 million people into destitute refugees. Nevertheless, it is not beyond the capacity of the richer nations to give enough assistance to reduce any further suffering to very small proportions. So he's saying that nations and people have not taken action to reduce the suffering, most importantly, giving to relief funds, charitable giving. The decisions and actions of human beings can prevent this kind of suffering. Unfortunately, human beings have not made the necessary decisions. At the individual level, people have, with very few exceptions, not responded to the situation in any significant way. Generally speaking, people have not given large sums to relief funds. They have not written to their parliamentary representatives demanding increased government assistance. They have not demonstrated in the streets, held symbolic fasts, or done anything else directed toward providing the refugees with the means to satisfy their essential needs. At the government level, no government has given the sort of massive aid that would enable the refugees to survive for more than a few days. Britain, for instance, has given rather more than most countries. It has to date given 14,750,000 pounds. For comparative purposes, Britain's share of non-recoverable development costs of the Anglo-French Concord project is already in excess of 275 million, and on present estimates that 440 million, it will reach 440 million. The implication is that the British government values a supersonic transport more than 30 times as highly as it values the lives of 9 million refugees. So he's pointing out that, okay, well, this is how much Britain's given, and this is more than 30 times less what they have put into this transport, supersonic transport mode. And he's making the comparison, well, does this mean that they care about this transport more than 30 times as much as they value the lives of 9 million refugees? And it's interesting when you put it that way, which sort of moves it a little bit into our morality. Australia is another country which, on a per capita basis, is well up in the aid to Bengal table. Australia's aid, however, amounts to less than 1/12 of the cost of Sydney's new Opera House. the total amount given from all sources now stands at about $65 million. The estimated cost of keeping the refugees alive for more than 1 year is $464 million. Most refugees have now been in the camps for more than 6 months. The World Bank has said that India needs a minimum of $300 million in assistance from other countries before the end of the year. It seems obvious that assistance on this scale will not be forthcoming. India will be forced to choose between letting the refugees starve or diverting funds from her own development program, which will mean that more of her own people will starve in the future. So he's pointing out, well, how is India supposed to care for all of these refugees with no external help? That people are going to starve if no one helps. These are the essential facts about the present situation in Bengal, so far as it concerns us here. There is nothing unique about this situation except its magnitude. The Bengal emergency is just the latest and most acute of a series of major emergencies in various parts of the world, arising both from natural and from man-made causes. There are also many parts of the world in which people die from malnutrition and lack of food independent of any special emergency. I take Bengal as my example only because it is the present concern and because the size of the problem has ensured that it has been given adequate publicity. Neither individuals nor governments can claim to be unaware of what is happening there. So he's used this Bengal example at the beginning just because he's like, well, this is what's happening at the moment, and this is what people have been seeing in the media. But these sorts of starvation, these awful things are happening everywhere. He's only using it as an example, but ultimately he's trying to point out that there are people starving and dying of malnutrition everywhere, and we aren't giving that much money to charity. What are the moral implications of a situation like this? So you might want to tag morality here. In what follows, I shall argue that the way people in relatively affluent countries react to a situation like that in Bengal cannot be justified indeed. The whole way we look at moral issues, our moral conceptual scheme needs to be altered, and with it, the way of life that has come to be taken for granted in our society. And that bit in green there is what the argument of the entire piece is. That in more affluent countries, we need to be giving money to less affluent countries. And a lot of it is that we need to change the whole way we look at moral issues, that our moral conceptual scheme, as it is, it needs to change. That the world is changing, and I guess we need to change with it. To explain sort of what he means by changing our moral conceptual scheme, in the foreword that he's written later, years and years later, he uses an example of a camera. And that's quite a good way to think about, like, why do we need to change our moral conceptual scheme? Like, why do we need to change how we approach moral situations? And he says that, for the most part, we can use the automatic on a camera. We just use the automatic lens focus, all of that. And then in some situations, however, we have to adjust the lens ourselves. So I think that's quite an interesting and quite a good way of sort of explaining why we need to change how we react. Once upon a time, we didn't have the ability to give and to help people in faraway countries, but now we do. And it's happened so quickly that perhaps we actually need to be adjusting our lens focus when it comes to making our moral decisions. So hopefully you've tagged that morality in your book. In arguing for this conclusion, I will not, of course, claim to be morally neutral. I shall, however, try to argue for the moral position that I take, so that anybody who accepts certain assumptions to be made explicit will, I hope, accept my conclusion. So he is not morally neutral. We actually know probably a lot of first year university. Well, I know Monash's first year university philosophy course starts with Peter Singer's practical ethics, and he is a very staunch utilitarian in that. He's changed his views quite a bit as the years have gone on, but he's quite well known for being a preference utilitarian, which you may remember from year 11 philosophy. But he's not morally neutral, but he's saying that for the purpose of this paper, he is going to just make an assumption that all of us have um, certain moral assumptions. And he is a utilitarian, but he's going to try to appeal to all people, not just the utilitarians in this piece. And he's going to connect to things that we all generally accept. And here I begin with the assumptions that he's going to accept. I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And most of us would agree with that. Doesn't matter if we're a utilitarian or not. Um, most of us agree with that. I think that most people will agree about this, although one may reach the same view by different routes. You might reach that it is bad from a utilitarian perspective, but you might also reach it from a rights-based ethics perspective. I shall not argue for this view. People can hold all sorts of eccentric positions, and perhaps from some of them it would not follow that death by starvation is in itself bad. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to refute such positions, and so for brevity I will henceforth take this assumption as accepted. Those who disagree need read no further. So he's like, okay, I'm not going to spend time arguing why this is bad, why suffering and death from lack of food is bad. Um, if you have a different point of view, there's probably no point in reading the rest of this paper. There's no time to go through that. But most people are going to be like, yes, that's bad, and continue reading. My next point is this. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral or importance, we ought morally to do it. So here is the second thing that he is putting forward. If we can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing something of comparable moral importance, we ought to morally do it. And this links to our morality as well. And I think that most of us would also accept this, that if we can save someone at little to no cost to ourselves, we morally ought to do it. No matter where you come from, most of us will come to that same conclusion. And he's about to tell you what he means by without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. I mean, without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good comparable in significance to the bad thing that we can prevent. So that little section is what he means by comparable moral importance. This principle seems almost as uncontroversial as the last one. It requires us only to prevent what is bad and not promote what is good, and it requires this of us only when we can do it without sacrificing anything that is from the moral point of view comparably important. I could even, as far as the application of my argument to the Bengal emergency is concerned, qualify the point so as to make it. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. An application of this principle would be as follows. And this is where my favorite analogy comes in, the child drowning in the shallow pond. And this is the analogy that became so famous. And that really changed how we were talking about this and actually spiked a lot of people giving to charity. And I like the way Singer puts it. In my class, I generally go through asking a series of questions to help students to get there. But I'll read this and then I'll go through those questions so that you can see just sort of how big of an impact this analogy actually has. So an application of this principle would be as follows. If I'm walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. So the example he's using is if you're walking in a park, you see a child drowning in a shallow pond, you know you're going to get your clothes muddy if you try and save the child, but you still do it because getting your clothes muddy is not as comparable um, in terms of moral importance. Getting your clothes muddy, not as morally important as a child drowning. And as promised, I'll talk you through the example of the way that I usually introduce this to my class. We've already done it, and it's always really funny and always gets them really excited. So I begin by saying, okay, I want you to imagine that you're walking on your way to work, you're walking through a park, and you see a child drowning in a pond. Do you save the child? And everyone like laughs at me and says yes. Then I go, okay, you know by the magic of philosophy, now let's change it, that if you go in, you are going to get your clothes really dirty and your shoes really wet. Do you still save the child? Yes, we still save the child. Then I modify it even further. Okay, you've got your phone in your pocket, and for whatever reason, you cannot save the child without breaking your phone. And you know this. Do you still save the child from drowning? And everyone is still like, yeah, yeah, of course. Then I go, well, okay, it's going to make you late to work, and your boss will definitely fire you, and you will have less money and be able to survive less. Do you still survive the child? Or do you still save the child? And everyone almost always says yes. Even if I'm going to be late to work, even if I'm going to lose my job, I still save the child. And at that point, I go, okay, well, then how much money are you donating to charity? And that makes us think really hard. And that's when we start to come up with counterexamples. But Singer actually goes through a lot of these counterexamples. And there's a really good video on YouTube. I really recommend you watch it. Um, if you're from McKinnon or McClelland, it was a video Mr. Joy sent me. But it is a video of a guy trying this analogy with ChatGPT and basically convincing ChatGPT to make moral arguments because it's such a strong argument that originally it's like the ChatGPT is like, well, no, I can't give to charity. Like, you don't have to give to charity. It's good if you do. But then when you bring this in, ChatGPT ends up going, okay, well, I guess you do have to give to charity. You're morally obliged to. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking of counterexamples already. But definitely look up that video, ChatGPT, Child in the Pond. I'm sure it'll come up if you Google it or YouTube it. It's really good. All right, let's keep going. So, for to come back, let's just focus on what Singer has said. He has said, you see a child drowning in a pond, your clothes will get muddy if you save them. Presumably, you will still save the child. The uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive. If it were acted upon, even in its qualified form, our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. For the principle first takes, firstly, no account of proximity or distance. It makes no moral difference whether the person I can help is a neighbour's child 10 yards from me or a Bengali whose name I shall never know 10,000 miles away. So he's like, he knows that people are immediately going to be like, well, a child is like right in front of me, but the people in East Bengal, they're really far away. And he actually goes, well, no, it doesn't really matter. It shouldn't matter if it's the child next door or whether it's someone far away. Um, Secondly, the principle makes no distinction between cases in which I am the only person who could or possibly do anything, and cases in which I am just one among millions in the same position. So he's saying that it doesn't really matter how far away you are from the people who are suffering, and it doesn't really matter if there are other people who could help versus if you are the only one. And the best way to think about this is that if you could see a child drowning through a computer screen, would you still try to save them? Like if you had the means to save them, I don't know, you had a robot or something that could pull the child out from a faraway distance, would you still do it? Most people would say yes, I would still save the child. Same with if there were other people standing around. If you're walking through the park and there's a child drowning and there's a million people just standing there like staring at it like, what? Oh, I don't know what to do. You would still jump in and still save the child. You wouldn't, even if other people were standing around watching, doing nothing, you would still save the child. So that's a good way to think about it. So in this particular principle, that he is trying to argue for. It doesn't matter. Distance doesn't matter, and number of people around don't matter. So he says, I do not think I need to say much in defense of the refusal to take proximity and distance into account. The fact that a person is physically near us so that we have personal contact with him may make it more likely that we shall assist him, but this does not show that we ought to help him rather than another who happens to be further away. If we accept any principle of impartiality, universalizability, equality, or whatever, we cannot discriminate against someone merely because he is far away from us. So we cannot, like, why are we discriminating against different people based on how close or how far away we are? And I like this bit in brackets, or we are far away from him, because we're very much framing it on, well, he's like 10,000 miles away from me, or is it I'm 10,000 miles away from him? Admittedly, it is possible that we are in a better position to judge what needs to be done to help a person near to us than one far away, and perhaps also provide the assistance we judge to be necessary. If this were the case, it would be a reason for helping those near to us first. This may have been a justification for being more concerned with the poor in one's own town than with famine victims in India. So he's about to rebut against why should we care for our own people first. Or a lot of people will say, well, we should care for the people near to us first. Unfortunately, for those who like to keep their moral responsibilities limited, instant communication and swift transportation have changed the situation. From the moral point of view, the development of the world into a global village has made an important, though still unrecognized, difference in our moral situation. Expert observers and supervisors sent out by famine relief organizations or permanently stationed in famine-prone areas can direct our aid to a refugee in Bengal almost as effectively as we could get it to someone in our own block. There would seem, therefore, to be no possible justification for discriminating on geographical grounds. So he's rebutted this about we should care for people close to us first, when he's like, well, actually, we have so many expert advisors and supervisors, especially as we're becoming more globalized. And as it becomes more and more easy for us to access other countries, and even thinking 2025 compared to 1971, it is a lot easier for us to access and help others in faraway countries than it was even 100 years ago. But his rebuttal to this is essentially that because it's so easy, it's just as easy to help people in your own city as helping people in Bengal. So there's not really an argument there. And you might disagree with this. This might be a point where you put a little star and think of some counterexamples or some other things. I know what the majority of you are going to be thinking right now. You're going to be thinking, well, when I give to charity, I don't know that the money is definitely going to help. And I don't know for certain that I will definitely save people. We'll come back to that at the end and see what Peter Singer has to say first. And then we'll come back to that. But I know that that's probably on your mind at the moment. There may be greater need to defend the second implication of my principle, that the fact there are millions of other people in the same position in respect to the Bengali refugees as I am does not make the situation significantly different from the situation in which I am the only person who can prevent something very bad from occurring. Again, of course, I admit there is a psychological difference between the cases. One feels less guilty about doing nothing if one can point to others similarly placed who have also done nothing. So here's that example. Like if you have lots of people standing around watching the child, you can feel less guilty about not saving the child. But it doesn't mean that it's any less of a moral obligation for you to save the child, because you can be like, oh, well, Jimmy didn't do it. Yeah, you can try and make yourself feel better, but morally, does that actually have any implications? Similarly placed who have done nothing. Yet this can make no real difference in our moral obligations. Should I consider that I am less obliged to pull the drowning child out of the pond if on looking around I see other people no further away than I am who have also noticed the child but are doing nothing? One has only to ask this question to see the absurdity of the view that numbers lessen obligation. It is a view that is an ideal excuse for inactivity. Unfortunately, most of the major evils, poverty, overpopulation, pollution, are problems in which everyone is almost equally involved. So um, there's his rebuttal to like, well, there's lots of other people who can save the people in Bengal and they're not doing anything. And he's just highlighting the absurdity of this, is what he's saying. He's saying this is an absurd view. Next one. The view that numbers do not make a difference can be made plausible if stated in this way. If everyone in circumstances like mine gave £5 to the Bengal Relief Fund, there would be enough to provide food, shelter, and medical care for the refugees. There is no reason why I should give more than anyone else in the same circumstances as I am, because therefore I have no obligation to give more than £5. Each premise in this argument is true, and the argument looks sound. It may convince us, unless we notice that it is based on a hypothetical premise, although the conclusion is not stated hypothetically. The argument would be sound if the conclusion were, if everyone in circumstances like mine were to give £5, I would have no obligation to give more than £5. If the conclusion were so stated, however, it would be obvious that the argument has no bearing on a situation in which it is not the case that everyone else gives £5. This, of course, is the actual situation. It is more or less certain that not everyone in circumstances like mine will give £5. So there will not be enough to provide the needed food, shelter, and medical care. Therefore, by giving more than £5, I will prevent more suffering than I would if I just gave £5. So he's looking at, okay, well, because I know that other people aren't going to give, does that mean that I should be giving more? It might be thought that this argument has an absurd consequence, since the situation appears that very few people are likely to give substantial amounts. It follows that I and everyone else in similar circumstances ought to give as much as possible. That is, at least up to the point at which by giving more, one would begin to cause serious suffering for oneself and one's dependents, perhaps even beyond this point, to the point of marginal utility, at which by giving more, one would cause oneself and one's dependents as much suffering as one would prevent in Bengal. If everyone does this, however, there will be more than can be used for the benefit of the refugees, and some of the sacrifice will have been unnecessary. Thus, if everyone does what he ought to do, the result will not be as good as it would be if everyone did a little less than he ought to do, or if only some do all that they ought to do. He says, so what he's looking at is should we give until we have equal circumstances as the people in East Bengal? Should we give until we're equal? But he says, but if everyone did this, there would be unnecessary suffering. And he's essentially saying we need to look at what it would be if everyone did it, because we are all obliged. The paradox here arises only if we assume that the actions in question, sending money to relief funds, are performed more or less simultaneously and are also unexpected. For if it is to be expected that everyone is going to contribute something, then clearly each is not obliged to give as much as he would have been obliged to had others not been giving too. And if everyone is not acting more or less simultaneously, then those giving later will know how much more is needed and will have no obligation to give more than is necessary to reach this amount. To say this is not to deny the principle that people in the same circumstances have the same obligations, but to point out that the fact that others have given or may be expected to give is a relevant circumstance. Those giving after it has become known that many others are giving and those giving before are not in the same circumstances. So the seemingly absurd consequence of the principle I've put forward can only occur if people are in error about the actual circumstances. That is, if they think they are giving when others are not, but in fact, they are giving when others are. The result of let me scroll down. The result of everyone doing what he really ought to do cannot be worse than the result of everyone doing less than he ought to do, although the result of everyone doing what he reasonably believes he ought to do could be. If my arguments so far have been sound, neither our distance from a preventable evil nor the number of other people who, in respect to that evil, are in the same situation as we were, lessens our obligation to mitigate or prevent that evil. I shall therefore take it as established the principle I asserted earlier. As I have already said, I need to assert it is only from a qualified form. If it is in our power to prevent something else very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything else morally significant, we ought morally to do it. And I guess what's happening here is that we're getting these additional premises, 3 and 4, that we do have power to prevent suffering by giving to charity, and therefore we morally ought to give to charity. The outcome of this argument is that our traditional moral categories are upset. The traditional distinction between duty and charity cannot be drawn, or at least not in the place we normally draw it. Giving money to the Bengal Relief Fund is regarded as an act of charity in our society. The bodies which collect money are known as charities. These organizations see themselves in this way. If you send them a check, you will be thanked for your generosity because giving money is regarded as an act of charity. It is not thought that there is anything wrong with not giving. And here's what he's sort of showing. He's trying to show that we have an obligation to give to these relief funds, but we act like they're charity. We be like, oh, thank you so much for your generosity. When he's saying, well, actually, morally, we have a moral obligation to help these people. And this is what he's exploring here: is that we think it's generosity. The charitable man may be praised, but the man who is not charitable is not condemned. People who do not feel in any way ashamed or guilty about spending money on new clothes or a new car instead of giving it to famine relief. Indeed, the alternative does not occur to them. This way of looking at the matter cannot be justified. When we buy new clothes not to keep ourselves warm but to look well dressed, we are not providing for any important need. We would not be sacrificing anything significant if we were to continue to wear our old clothes and give the money to famine relief. So he's like, well, whenever you go buy new clothes, you could be better spending that money giving to famine relief and sacrificing your new clothes, unless it is because you need to keep warm. It is not a moral, a comparable moral circumstance. By doing so, we would be preventing another person from starving. It follows from what I have said earlier that we ought to give money away rather than spend it on clothes which we do not need to keep us warm. To do so is not charitable or generous, nor is it the kind of act which philosophers and theologians have called supererogatory, which means to go beyond what is needed. And Vey also uses that term and discusses that term. So Singer and Vey, very good ones to compare. An act which it will be good to do but not wrong to do. On the contrary, we ought to give money away, and it is wrong not to do so. So he's saying that giving to relief funds is not charity or supererogatory, which means going above and beyond what's obliged, because it is wrong to ignore others' needs for your own personal wants. And some of you might be finding this quite a strong argument. I wonder how many of you are going to log off from this video and then go donate to charity. Now, as promised, I did say I would talk through, okay, well, we don't know that money going to charity or money going to relief funds is actually going to help people. Peter Singer's thought of that in a later book, the one, The Life You Can Save. He has actually talks all about this. He also has a website where he goes through and gives you facts and statistics about different charities and how much money actually goes to helping the people in need. I guess you have to trust Peter Singer, though, or trust Peter Singer's organization to trust that charity. Another thing that I guess is worth considering when it comes to, well, I don't know whether the money is going to actually help people, is would you still save the drowning child even though you don't know whether he's going to still drown or not? Would you still pull a child out of the water even though you're not sure? Probably yes. There's a good chance that the money will go to the right place. So in that way, you are still morally obliged to do it. And that, I guess, is my defense of Peter Singer. That's not something I would say, I thought I would say. But I guess we need to look at this. We can't just shut him down by saying, well, okay, um, we don't know that the money is going to go to charity. It's a lot more complex than that. So hopefully that makes your evaluations of Singer a little bit stronger. Let's consider what he's really saying instead of creating a straw man of what he's saying. I hope this video has helped. I'm going to end the video here. Um, please, if you watched this and you're in my class, comment below. I was going to say something really funny, but I forgot what it was. Comment below, Singer is singing. So that I know that you actually watch this, because I don't think you guys are watching it. There's other students in other schools that are watching this. So if you watch this all the way through and you are one of my students, write Singer is singing in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you for Unit 4.